Thank you. Uh, such an honor and privilege to be here with General J.J. Singh and Air Vice Marshal Subramaniam. These are very old friends of mine. I've followed their writings for many years. And both of them actually belong to a very, they're writers with a difference because they're part of a very small core of military brass who've chosen to write on military history. It's a very small circle of armed forces officers who choose to write on military history, and they are even fewer armed forces brass who write military history. I'm not talking of autobiographies. So please give them a big hand. And while we are here to talk about the century of discord, I want to talk about another century. Now this year, it's going to be the centenary year of the Official Secrets Act. Now the Official Secrets Act, what we call OSA, is what the Indian state uses to define what a state secret is and how people violating those state secrets are to be dealt with. And the year of the act coming into effect, 1923, clearly tells you it was a colonial act by which the British used to crack down on the native population, the spies and saboteurs among the Indian people. But it's tragic that 100 years later, such a loosely defined law still is in effect. It's the blunt force instrument that the state uses to crack down on people is so ambiguously worded and loosely defined. And as a journalist, I believe that this is what has inhibited the Defense Ministry from releasing and declassifying military histories and documents. And in fact, there's this, I cannot continue without this one great anecdote. A couple of years back, there was a journalist who filed a right to information application. He asked the Defense Ministry, can I know what the Defense Ministry's declassification policy is? And he gets the reply a few weeks later that the declassification policy is classified. So that just illustrates the narrow space with which, in which military historians and writers navigate in. And you know, I'm going to ask the first question to General J.J. Singh that, sir, was it easier for you as a former Chief of Army Staff and Governor of Arunachal Pradesh to write this book with a lot of, you know, where a lot of military histories involved, contested military histories involved, boundaries, negotiation points and all that are involved? Was it tougher for you? Was it easier for you?
Well, Sandeep, thank you very much for your introduction. Also, your question is very interesting. While I was Army Chief, I had 2 occasions before that as an additional DGMO to have the Henderson Brooks report in my almirah locked up, top secret, but I could be in a position to see through it, and I did see through it, but that's in wraps. After I became Chief, I could still ask for it and see it, but then we were not to be heard about what we saw. But after I doffed the uniform, I hung my spurs, no one was ready to allow me to have access to these documents. Not only these, any researcher, including my friend Arjun, would have realized that they are, like he says, Official Secret Act is also confidential risk policy. I mean, how vague can it be? But anyway, we had to struggle. I can assure you that, you know, Sandeep, I had to find places where I got information. Some were not knowing, the left hand doesn't know the right hand. So there are occasions where you can get information, but I got it from various sources, including the British archives, which are open to every scholar. And I think anybody who wants seriously to write something about any affairs which deal with India, China, and the British India period can get wonderful information, which is contained, nuggets of that is contained in my book.
Air Vice Marshal Subramaniam, how easy was it for you to write those 2 fantastic books you've written on military history?
So first of all, thanks to the JLF for having me on this Litfest, and it's wonderful to be sharing a platform with General JJ and you, Sandeep. Now, there are two planes on which I'd like to answer this question of yours. The first plane is to mirror some of General JJ's views, which say that it was difficult, extremely difficult to get official information because declassification of of particularly military action in the post-1971 period has been a bit of a gray area. And this is what is this is what is the lament of many journalists and many academics who want to write contemporary Indian military history. But on a second plane, let me tell you that I found ways to not pierce through the system, but work with the system. And working with the system primarily involved in tapping the vast reservoir of oral history that exists amongst our veterans. So this is how I did it. Instead of lamenting that, that the air headquarters or the army headquarters or the naval headquarters is not able to give me with files or archives, I said, let me speak to veterans with combat experience and let me create my own repository of oral history, which I've done. And how do you best get to the truth with oral history is through a process called triangulation. So for example, those of you who are familiar with the Kargil conflict was and still is a contentious conflict to tell a story about. So how best you get to the truth of what actually happened is you speak to three different people who were in the same battle space. And then you arrive at the most probable thing which would have happened. And I must say that this has been one methodology that has worked wonders for me. And I have really got very little pushback on both my books, which cover a large span of military history, from any of the service headquarters or from the Ministry of Defense. So Sandeep, while declassification of military archives is essential for more broad-based writing of military history, but I think oral archives or oral history is also extremely important if you want to wade through this difficult terrain.
It's a fascinating response, and I don't believe I've heard that word triangulation being used for military history writing. It's a very unique. I mean, triangulation is, if those of you who follow combat tactics would know that this is how direction finding is done to intercept enemy signals. That you triangulate a probable source of that radar emission, and that's being used by AVM Subramaniam. So now we know where he's getting all his information from. That's a fascinating use of that word, and I'm going to remember that.
If I may add,
yes, of course, sir.
It also is important to know what the other side story is. You see, it's always all right to know what we have done and what our people tell us about it. But what the other side, for example, Kargil War, I was the additional DGMO directing the war from Delhi. The DGMO has a vast canvas, but additional DGMO is the actual firefighter in military operations of Indian Army. And I knew exactly what has happened, and in 12 pages I've encapsulated the entire Kargil war, how it was fought, how it was planned, what the Pakistanis' devious plans were, and what happened, how they kept it a secret in their own country, and how we allowed our media to go into the forward areas. And you may remember our journalist who said, I'm in the bunker, I'm speaking from there. I think she made her mark as a journalist then. India was open. I allowed them to go and do it. But also books have come from the other side today, which absolutely second what we have analyzed and said about the Kargil war. This is just one example I'm giving you. That, and also as far as China is concerned, I went to parts of China and Tibet where no one has gone, not even our embassy people have gone, and then researched and I met a guide. He happened to be a Dorji. I said, my God, my chief minister in Arunachal Pradesh is Khandu Dorji. Must be your clan. He says, perhaps. But what about you? He said, my brother gone to Dharamsala. Now, what information he gave me was a very good insight into what's China's way of handling Tibet and various other things, and how they look at the border and Tibet.
But that point you made, sir, about the information, ease of information, and how the other side views wars. It's interesting because in India you have a democracy that's open. The kind of information, if there is a military casualty, we know within minutes and hours, and the families
Absolutely.
are informed. And in fact, at times news travels so quickly that the families get to know of it through the media and not through the military. So you're looking at, on the one hand, a very open system, and on the other, you have Pakistan, which does not even acknowledge till date. More than 20 years later, they do not acknowledge the Kargil conflict. It took them a decade to acknowledge that they had lost so many hundreds of Northern Light infantrymen. And today, nearly 3 years later, we still don't know how many PLA soldiers died in the Galwan clash. Whereas we have the names, numbers, the families, the histories of all our fallen dead. So how do you reconcile with this thing of this information overload on one side and these literally walls that are, barricading information on the two other sides? You want to take that, sir?
I think we should be proud of being a democracy and embracing the armed forces as an intrinsic element of this democracy. And therefore, I think we should be able to leverage the lack of transparency within an adversary and leverage it to our own advantage, right? For example, at no stage does the Chinese establishment acknowledge the People's Liberation Army as an intrinsic element of nation building or of the Chinese Communist Party. It is a given that the People's Liberation Army is subordinate to the Chinese Communist Party. On the other hand, India's armed forces are acknowledged by society and by the by governments that they've played an important role in India's democratic journey till now. So I think we shouldn't be really too worried about the lack of transparency within our within adversaries or competitive societies, and I think we should only strengthen the transparency and the I would say the convergence between the armed forces and society at large in a democracy like India.
You want to add to that, sir?
No, I would like to talk about the Chinese. And the
Right. Before that, very quickly, so one observation and one question as well. The fact is that the modern Indian political state was created by the British. In the 19th century, they used native Indian sepoys. They raised native armies, the Bengal army, the Bombay army, and the Madras army to defeat the two largest empires there, the Sikh Empire and the Maratha Empire. And they, on the foundations of this, they created the British Indian Empire, which then they ruled for about 100 years. Now, literally all the wars that we have seen in the last 75 years or so have had a colonial origin. I mean, whether you look at it in the West with Pakistan or in the North with China, they've all, I mean, you show me a conflict, I'll show you 10 colonial maps where they base this conflict on. How do you think this colonial overhang has kind of impacted our national security and the kind of wars that we've fought since independence?
Sandeep, basically our army has the legacy that the British army left India and the Indian portion of it remained with us. The Muslim elements were given the choice, they could go and join the Pakistan army or go across the border. Some of them decided not to do so. My point is, yes, we had that background, we had that legacy, but surely we have improved upon that after we got a drubbing in 1962, which I want to make it very clear was not really the fault of the military as much as it was the politicians and the bureaucrats and the foreign service and others who misled Nehru to the point where he thought that Chinese will never attack us. There may be border skirmishes here and there, but well, even then, I don't think a border skirmish means the soldiers are cannon and fodder. They can be allowed to die just like that because you haven't thought through what you want to do. So I think we have, since 1962, we have learnt our lessons. I remember I was in the academy then, and I was commissioned in 64. We used to do 25 kilometers run every day with the pack and the weapon. We became a strong army because we found that we needed to be more physically fit, and otherwise our tactics and other things also improved drastically. We produced results in 65, and we produced the outstanding victory any country can ever dream of is 1971, where we created another nation. So Indian armed forces have the pride of having been the backbone of our country, and as Arjun brought out, the democracy is our strength. Our diversified democracy is our strength, whereas in the case of China, because I've studied China 47 years, their weakness is a centralized communist rule, which is like a communist dictatorship, where they do not have the kind of freedoms which we enjoy in India, and also where everything is controlled by, today, by one person, Xi Jinping.
So, Sandy, your hypothesis of linking most of our conflicts in independent India with remnants of our colonial legacy is a fascinating one, is an interesting one. Because for those of you who remember that most strategic commentators in the aftermath of Indian independence didn't give the Indian state a chance. Most of them predicted that India is too diverse a nation to survive, and that it wouldn't be long before the breakup of India would commence, very akin to the Balkanization you know, of Yugoslavia, which took place many decades later. But that didn't happen. And one of the reasons why it was suggested that it may happen is because of these colonial fracture lines that were left behind. And when I say colonial fracture lines, the undemarcated border with China is a colonial legacy. The ceasefire line which was brokered by the United Nations after the 1947-48 is actually a colonial legacy. If you look at it, strands of the Sri Lankan conflict also, which precipitated an Indian involvement, was because the British transported Tamil labor into central Sri Lanka to the tea plantations. And they also formed an element of this ethnic strife that took place later on. Nagaland, the entire northeastern construct, was a colonial construct. And a young Indian nation actually was constantly grappling as to how do you create geographical boundaries within this unstructured colonial space which people can call their own. And which is why when the state of Nagaland was created, it left behind certain embers into adjoining states of Manipur and Arunachal Pradesh, which still festers even today. The geographical contours of Assam still face stress today. So you know, that's a fascinating construct, Sandeep, and I think it's a good idea to dwell on in a future book.
That's a great idea. I'm going to take it up right away for another book. But you know, Arjun Subramaniam, one of the most significant paragraphs in your book, your first book in fact, was India's Wars. I remember where you've written the fact that how the Indian military has had a very diverse experience in fighting full-scale wars, the First World War, the Second World War. It's fought insurgencies, it's fought in Mesopotamia, it's fought in Afghanistan, it's fought in the jungles of Myanmar, and of course all the wars that we fought since independence. Now all of these wars seem to have just become military histories. I'm quoting, I don't remember the exact lines that you used, but the essence of it was you said that all of these were treated as military histories and locked away in cupboards. They were never distilled into tactical and strategic planning for the armed forces. So why do you think this complete compartmentalization of combat experience and military histories have things changed now, several years later?
No, things have changed. But what I implied in that particular book, and I'll give you an immediate operational analogy. Look, the Indian Army in particular has been engaged in classical counterinsurgency operations since the late 1950s in Nagaland, right? And after that, it has gathered a huge wealth of experience in broad spectrum counterinsurgency operations, counter-infiltration operations, counter-terrorism operations, and yet the counterinsurgency doctrine that is popularized the world over today is the one written by David Petraeus after the disastrous American experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is wham. But actually winning hearts and minds and military civic action is an Indian army legacy since the 50s. But we have failed to appropriate it as our own. And one of the reasons why we have failed to appropriate it as our own is because our reluctance to look at history, to record history, and distill it into what you said is operational doctrine. Maybe General JJ, with his, with his experience as the chief, may be able to throw some additional light.
In fact, General JJ, I must mention, because he's going to be too modest to mention this, the winning hearts and minds, he's a living example of that. I don't know if many of you know the fact that he has an adopted son from Kashmir and he has an adopted son from one of the northeastern states. These are the two states. I mean, this is remarkable. I don't think any Indian armed forces officer has done what he's done. And one of his, your son, correct me if I'm wrong, sir, he's commissioned into the Indian Army?
In the 9 Marathas.
In your battalion. That's correct. I don't see any such parallel anywhere in the world where a country fighting counterinsurgency, the army chief adopts two children from those counterinsurgency zones. And this is the biggest example, I think, of winning hearts and minds. You want to talk more about this?
In fact, Sandeep, the joke going around was when I was the army chief, they said, oh, the chief married late because his children are in army public school. Then somebody told them, no, his children are married and settled, but these are fostered children. But it was just to tell everybody that everyone looks after your own family, your own kith and kin, but who should also look after the others is someone special. So we try to give an example, and that is it. And very interestingly, what point has been mentioned just now, I want to say that India has inherent strengths, being a democracy, and India has all the potential to be a superpower in the future. It's got parliamentary democracy, it's got a constitution, one of the best in the world, it's got a apolitical armed forces, it's got a judiciary which is independent, media which is totally free, sometimes irresponsible, but that I'm sure Sandeep will agree with me. They come up with some bloomers. I'll give one bloomer, that Sangpo river flows in Tibet, just other side of the Himalayas, and they naturally have to cross that huge obstacle of 1 kilometer wide at some places, and they made bridges. But then they said, oh, see, those are dams. So I said, my dear friends who are innocent journalists, poor things they don't know. The signature of a dam means a pondage, a large area inundated because the water has been blocked. And the signature of a bridge is, it's got arches from one span to the other span. And you see the arches in the shadow of the photographs, then you don't make this silly mistake. So they have not made many dams as we claim, because our people are not educated enough or aware enough of what the reality is. But notwithstanding that, I would like to say that we have all the checks and balances in place so that we can be a competitor to China. And as forecast by some people now, I was hearing their discussion in Davos, their thinking is that India might overtake China at some stage in the next 20-30 years.
I have another story to that, sir. An armed forces officer once called me part of the 5th column. And I corrected him and I said, surely you mean the 4th estate. But General JJ, in your book on the McMahon line, it came out in 2019, and it's interesting because it came out a full year before the Chinese mobilized on the line of control, and you've had those skirmishes. We've had Galwan that's happened, and we have today 100,000 people facing off at super high altitude. I don't think it's ever happened in human history before. But even as that unfolds, that confrontation unfolds, I'm just going to quote these two lines from your book, very interesting, because it's a little undimmed by all the skirmishes that we've seen. You've said that India and China must have a constructive relationship which can redefine the contours of the 21st century. Do you think that a war or even a border skirmish, I mean, a lot of people say that 1962 was a border war. A lot of other people say that it's actually a skirmish. The Chinese call it a skirmish. It's just two divisions that were involved, right? So, do you think that war is inevitable between India and China?
Very good question, Sandeep. Firstly, 62 was not a border skirmish. It was Mao Zedong's decision to teach India a lesson. More importantly, Prime Minister Nehru a lesson, because they felt that Prime Minister Nehru was trying to hog the limelight in the Afro-Asian Nations Committee. And in fact, in Bandung, in the conference there, Nehru was introducing Chow and Lai as a mother hen. Sir, I will make you meet so and so, I'll make you, you know, he was shepherding him. And Chow and Lai was smirking, you know, thinking that he thinks that I'm so innocent. We were dealing with veterans of the long war, Mao Zedong and Chow and Lai. They were not amateurs. Our statesmen were world class. Nehru was a world class statesman, but he was not a strategician. He was not a person who could think that these people will let me down and stab me in the back. That is what I want to say, that with China we have to be very careful, because it's a very clever, smart and devious adversary. Also, just for information, I have a few slides which will tell you the correct perspective how to view China and India. And first and foremost, I want to tell you, we were never neighbors in history. Two civilizations grew apart about 1,500 kilometers, and Beijing was not the capital, Xi'an was the capital, and India, of course, was Delhi. But the fact is, it was almost a separation of 1,500 to 2,000 kilometers. So we never interacted that way, actively, as a neighbor. We never had neighborly relations. Tibet was the neighbor for India, and between India and China, Tibet was the buffer state. Now, I want to tell you that between Tibet and India, the boundaries, and between Tibet and China, the boundary was, there was a stone marker, and on the stone marker was written, east of this point is China, and west of this point is Tibet. It didn't draw a line, so you could interpret it anyway. That was the way Asiatic countries did not have demarcated boundaries, and Lord Curzon in 1904 in his lectures Romaine has said that Asiatic countries did not have borders defined, demarcated, unless it was under the pressure of the European colonial powers. What I'm saying is that China was never our neighbor. It was only in 1951. Ladies and gentlemen, you can understand the psychology of a country which says in 1951, when they came into Tibet in a big way militarily, they said, we have come to liberate Tibet. And liberate them from whom was the question. Nobody asked, nobody answered. So pointed issue is that when they became our neighbors, they started formulating the boundary, and they drew their own perception of the boundary, which included Aksai Chin. Ladies and gentlemen, that I will show on the slides, but basically they unilaterally drew their boundary, and you may not know, up to 1954, if you saw Indian maps, there are three portions between Karakoram Pass and the Nepalese border where it's written boundary undemarcated, boundary undemarcated. Oh, no, that shows 1,500 kilometers was just fine print, you know, as you see, looks like a line. That is the way it was delineated. In 1954, Prime Minister Nehru said, I don't like this, please draw a line. And the survey and other people, I'm afraid, I'm not very sure whether military was co-opted in that exercise or not, but this line is the contentious line between the border of Nepal and up to Karakoram Pass. And why I want to say this is that if we didn't have a line, why are we saying not an inch of our territory we will cede to the Chinese. Well, the Chinese don't have a claim there either. They were not present, they didn't have any administration. So the fact is both sides should have sat on a table and decided the line. It was not done. And eventually it led to this war. This war was avoidable, I can tell you, ladies and gentlemen, but it was because the perceptions were different. I show you a map. This is a map which you can see on your screen. It shows Tibet and the one marked dark in dark. It's a already moth-eaten Tibet. Otherwise, Tibet was very big. It was 1/3 the size of United States of America. I show you one more. This is where India and China are. Well, the world calls China the Middle Kingdom. I don't think they are the Middle Kingdom. They are the East Asia, you could call the center of East Asia. If anybody has got the right to call themselves the Middle Kingdom or the Central Asia is India. Sorry, I go back. You see the map of India, we are more centrally located and we have the Indian Ocean named after us. I go to the next one. You see these rivers, very important to understand geography because Napoleon lost his war because he didn't study geography. After that, the Germans went into Russia, they lost because of winter, the general winter. Before that, Hannibal lost because of the geography. Here the geography, if you see where China is written and where Myanmar is written, there are 4 rivers there. Easternmost is Yangtze-Kiang, then comes the Mekong, then comes the Salween, and then comes the Irrawaddy. Now you have to cross these deep gorges to reach from China to Lhasa. You can see Lhasa in the center. The Chinese prefer to travel by sea rather than go through this tortuous terrain. And I'm not joking, it's geography. 50 kilometers apart, these rivers are bottlenecks. And today, if China thinks they can fight and win a war with us, these arteries going over them, the railway line which they have made, 3-4 precision guided missiles are good enough. Arjun will bear me out that you isolate the battlefield theater of Tibet. So we are not going to be very worried that they are stronger than us. They have got more army, they've got more air force, more navy, because it's my punch, it can only reach here. The Chinese mainland is so far away, they punch, and which it reaches in Tibet will be good enough for us to face and handle that and give them a bloody nose. The next point I'm making is the Chinese believe in psychological imperialism. That's the word I have coined. The psychological imperialism means that they scare the opponent, scare a weaker country, and this psychological imperialism has been done by them against many countries. But with India, they tried, but they did not succeed. I'll go to the next one. This is, of course, the Potala Palace in Lhasa, where the Dalai Lama used to reside. This is very interesting. Lines are marked 1, 2, 3, 4. The first one is enlarged Tibet. That is what, when I said Tibet was 1/3 the size of United States of America. But line 2 shows you what was the boundary at one stage, and the dotted area is what Chinese captured in the 1905 and 10. And line 4 is the status quo of the actual boundary between China and Tibet. Now please see it closely. This line also dividing Tibet and China comes nowhere close to Arunachal Pradesh in India. This is what people should understand, that China was never anywhere close to us or a neighbor to us, even up to 1912. And after 1951, because they liberated Tibet, so-called, they captured it, they were our neighbors. Go to the next one. Now this is the place which is, you may have heard the Chinese saying that we have not signed the McMahon line. There were 3 plenipotentiaries and their signatures are here. In 2 places I have enlarged them further. One was Ivan Chen, the Chinese. One was Longchen Chatra, the Tibetan minister. Prime Minister, and then third was Henry McMahon, on whose name this McMahon line has been named. Now, I want to tell you that they tried to give this shaded area to China as an inducement to agree. But the best part is, which many people don't know, is that the Chinese did not object to the red line, which is the boundary between Tibet and India, but they objected to the blue line. You see, there is a blue line going south-north. That blue line divided Tibet and China. So you can understand the problem was between China and Tibet. They were fighting very fierce battles in that area. That's why they had the Simla conference. So I just wanted to show you this, and I go on to, this is a map which shows you, ladies and gentlemen, boundary undefined, boundary undefined, boundary. अब आप कैसे कह सकते हैं जी ये लाइन यहाँ से जाती है वहाँ से जाती है?
I'm going to bring in AVM Subramaniam on this at
Yeah,
this point.
I will just finish off. This is the road which is very important. This is the road which is in pink, is the Aksai Chin road. Chinese needed this road strategically to join Kashgar with Lhasa, and that's why they wanted Aksai Chin, whatever else may happen. And we did not see and join the dots and prevent them from doing that. And that is why we fought a war. Some areas in central India like Uttar Kashi, Chamoli, which Chinese are claiming, but this is a small one, and that is the end of what I wanted to tell you.
Thank you for that fascinating roundup of maps, sir. You use this word, this expression, psychological imperialism.
Yes.
How do we stand up to psychological imperialism, AVM Subramaniam?
Okay. If General JJ uses the term psychological imperialism, let me use one of my own. And and the term that I will use and the phrase that I will use is counter coercion. So let me explain myself a little further. Look, China is going to be India's principal military adversary over the next many decades. I don't have any illusions of a speedy rapprochement in the controversy and in the border dispute that India has with China. And therefore, if one has to look at a long-term strategy vis-a-vis China, I think there are two things. One is we need to manage China militarily, and the other one is that we need to contest China wherever the situation warrants. And how do you contest China? One is by evolving a strategy that I call as a counter-coercive strategy. Look, till now we've generally been reactive in our national security responses. And I think the only way to manage and contest China is if you're willing to be proactive, even preventive, and that is what I call a counter-coercive strategy. So a counter-coercive strategy is something that must lie at the heart of our military strategy to manage and contest China in the decades ahead.
Fascinating. I mean, counter-coercive strategy. I've lost count of the number of new words I've learned in this session. But thank you very much, gentlemen. And we have just time for one quick question. Plenty of hands,
yeah,
I know.
Sandeep, before that, can I just say something? Ladies and gentlemen, I have 1 point more to share with you. That is that can we solve this problem? Will there be a war or not? Firstly, between 1/3 of the whole mankind, there can't be a war, it will be a world war. So the war option is out. Secondly, there could be skirmishes, but they have learned their lessons with skirmishes, it doesn't work. Thirdly, I want to say that the boundary dispute can be resolved by a very bold and decisive political leadership, which at this moment both countries have. And also, they will have to explain to the people that there was no line, which people don't know. We must tell them that it was kept from the people, from the parliament till 1959, when they knew very well that we don't have a line. 1954 we drew the line in northern India. And second point I want to say that we must have a kind of, after all briefings being done by the two top leaders, to have a political coup which will define that yes, okay, this is done, because there were package deals before, package deals afterwards. Let's get on with our lives and become more prosperous countries. Let's rule the world as we were ruling 300 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. I'm afraid we've completely run out of time for questions, but Air Vice Marshal Subramaniam, and do we have 5 minutes? Yes. Did I hear 5 minutes? Okay, we've got 5 minutes. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Sandeep.
My question is in two parts. First is political and second is military. The first question relates to why after wars, that is 48, 65, 71 and the Kargil conflict of 99, we as a nation and especially the politicians don't seem to have learnt our lessons. 48, the war was stopped when we were winning and we could have had the entire POK with us. 65, we gave away Haji Pir, one of the most strategic locations on the Pir Panjal. It was negotiated by Mr. Lal Bahadur Shastri at Tashkent and we gave it away. 71, we had 93,000 prisoners of war. We could have easily negotiated with Pakistan and had a quid pro quo of saying that, okay, you return parts of Kashmir, POK, we're going to return these 93,000 people back to you. And fourth, in Kargil, why did we stop short and not use the Air Force in the initial stages? And once we were attacking them, why didn't we extend our area of attack and include more parts of Pakistan into our scheme of things? Fourth, this is the political part. Militarily, it is very good to say that we're a democracy, we follow orders and things like that. When has anyone amongst our top brass stood up and said, listen, this is the strategic vision of the nation. We are not going to agree with you. We're going to resign en masse. If you give away these 93,000 prisoners, we are not going to stand with the government of India. Where is the white paper in all of this? The bloopers and the blunders of the government of India and the military or the forge quietly agreeing with whatever has been wrong. In private, we keep saying that these are the blunders we have caused. Haji Pir is still rankling us.
I get your question, sir. Yeah. AVM Subramaniam, we want to take that question.
So now I must mention to you that the questioner is a dear friend and he's my coursemate from the National Defence Academy. Okay.
General JJ, you want to take that question?
So I think you could go first and then I will.
Basically, one thing I want to make clear, I was Army Chief, and let me tell you, very often we are these soft targets, you know, everybody snipes at us. Army Chiefs are spineless, they don't do this, they do this, should have done this way, that way. There are many angles to be seen, many dimensions to be seen when a national decision is to be taken. I'm not being soft. I refuse to give the Sachar committee a breakdown of the Indian Armed Forces, Indian Army, how many Sikhs, how many Christians, how many Hindus, how many Muslims, how many... I said, sorry, I look at my soldier, he's a brave warrior, I don't care where he comes from, what language he speaks, what religion he believes in. That's one. Secondly, also at Siachen Glacier, I said, we will not give it up. If you want us to do it, let the Pakistanis sign on the dotted line, on the map and on the ground. We'll take aerial photographs and put flags of different colors so we know where you were, where we are. So if you renege, because Pakistan is capable of reneging from any agreement, also China, let me just say, Chinese have reneged from many agreements and they have a very vague way of saying the time is not ripe. What do you mean by time is not ripe? Or they say, well, listen, you know, it was an unequal treaty. We were not strong enough, so we had to sign those treaties. So Pakistan is like that. But anyway, what I'm going to tell you is that when you weigh all these dimensions, certain decisions have to be accepted because we are a democracy and you'll agree with you, some mistakes are there, but chiefs are not so spineless as some people make them out to be.
Yes, sir. So Royal, I have two particular points as a military historian. One is that I agree that politico-military fusion over the years has been suboptimal. We are seeing signs of improvement right now, and let me tell you how. How many rounds, Sandy? 17 rounds of negotiations have taken place across the line of actual control. all 17 rounds of negotiations have had the Corps Commander of 14 Corps as part of those negotiations with the Chinese. So we are seeing far better politico-military fusion when it comes to resolving tricky boundary disputes with our principal adversaries. The second is that at several instances in our past, we have had senior military leadership with the guts to speak truth to power, right? So speaking truth to power is not alien to India's military leadership. Should we do it more often? Yes, we must do it more often. But to suggest that it is completely absent from our military leadership, I don't think is fair. Now, you listed out several occasions where we could not capitalize on operational victories and translate them into a strategic outcome. Now, if you look at the scorecard and you look at the number of occasions in which the Indian military or India has come out in military conflicts, except for 1962 and except for a bitter experience in Sri Lanka, we've really come out as a strong pillar of the state. How many times has the United States emerged victorious in the post-World War II era? Very rarely. But I'm not suggesting, I am not suggesting a chest-thumping kind of an approach as far as the Indian military is concerned. But what I'm saying is that the Indian military's track record in operation since 1947 has been pretty good. And I think the democracy must be proud of it.
Thank you very much, AVM Subramaniam. That's all we have time for. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Such an illuminating discussion as always, and over to the organizer.